Many of the women history calls mistresses were closer to spies than lovers. Their bedrooms held more political danger than any council chamber, and their silence decided fates no one ever credited to them. Power shifted in the dark, carried by whispers. The crown never heard clearly. Secrets lived longer than affection, and the cost of knowing was often survival itself. Tonight, you will step into the world where love watched more than it warmed. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step quietly into a Tudor bedchamber, long after the candles had melted low and the corridors had fallen silent, they would find that the softest whispers carried more weight than any decree written in daylight. The bed was not only a place of comfort, but a place where truth slipped out more easily than it ever would in the council hall. A king, wrapped in the warmth of affection, often forgot that the person lying beside him could hear more than just the beat of his heart. She could hear his doubts, his fears, his ambitions, and the secrets he meant to keep hidden even from himself. In Tudor England, intimacy created a false sense of safety. The king was surrounded by men who bowed, calculated, and measured every word. With them, he could never reveal the cracks in his confidence. But a mistress, sitting close enough to feel his breath on her shoulder, was different. She did not challenge him in public. She did not question his authority. Her silence felt like loyalty, and her closeness felt like trust. What he did not understand was that silence could be sharper than any blade, and trust could shift direction without anyone noticing. The art of listening was her weapon. She did not ask for details, yet details arrived. She did not demand confessions, yet confessions spilled out like water from a cracked jar. A king talked most freely in the dark. When the weight of the crown pressed less heavily and the worries of the day grew too large to keep contained, he believed he was unburdening himself. She believed she was gathering what she needed to survive. Both were right, and both were wrong. The bedchamber remained the most private place in the kingdom, even more private than the Queen's apartments or the privy chamber. Guards did not stand watch inside. Advisors did not linger. No one monitored conversations held beneath blankets warm from shared breath. The king entered those rooms, thinking he had left politics behind. The mistress entered, knowing politics had only shifted its shape. Power softened its voice at night, but it did not disappear. It whispered instead. In a world where court factions shifted like sand, information meant protection. A mistress without knowledge was fragile, easily replaced, easily discarded. A mistress who understood the king's mood, who sensed when his patience thinned, who listened carefully when he spoke of rival nobles or troublesome ministers. Such a woman could maintain her place far longer than one who relied on beauty alone. Beauty faded quickly in the Tudor court. Secrets lasted much longer. The king believed these women loved him honestly, and some did. But truth and strategy lived side by side in their hearts. Survival demanded awareness. If he mentioned a name too often, the mistress learned to remember it. If he muttered about betrayal, she traced the edges of his anger. If he confessed remorse, she stored that too, knowing tenderness could be as influential as fury. She observed without appearing to observe, and he revealed himself without realizing he had been seen. Yet these women did not set out to become spies. They became spies because the court allowed no other path. Every woman close to the king was watched, judged, and whispered about. Every gesture was examined. Every expression could be misinterpreted. To remain ignorant was dangerous. To remain informed was necessary. Their power was not official, not recorded, not acknowledged. But it was real, and it was born in the quiet moments when the king let his guard fall away. Some learned to guide conversations gently. A soft question placed at the right moment could draw out a confession he had meant to swallow. A sympathetic pause could lead him to fill the silence. A sigh could make him think she understood him better than anyone else. And perhaps she did, because she listened without the filter of politics. She listened to the man, not the monarch. But while she listened, she also assessed. She measured what information could be useful, what could protect her, what could harm her, and what could shift the balance of the court. He never suspected that affection could double as observation. He believed that the women who shared his bed shared only his heart. Yet in Tudor England, hearts were items traded as easily as jewels. A mistress could be dismissed with a gesture. A new favourite could be chosen overnight. Love, in its fragile form, could not shield a woman from danger, but knowledge could. Imagine lying beside a king whose life shaped the fates of thousands, knowing that every word he murmured might alter your own future. Imagine pretending not to hear, even as you remembered every syllable. Imagine offering comfort while trying to decide whether the information now resting in your hands could save you or destroy you. This was the reality for Tudor mistresses. Women who navigated intimacy as if it were a battlefield lined with velvet instead of swords. To the outside world, these relationships looked simple: romance, indulgence, desire. But beneath that surface lived a far more complicated truth. Love in the Tudor court was never just love. It was calculation, risk, observation, and survival woven together in the dark. The king whispered because he needed someone to listen. The mistress listened because she needed to endure. And in that exchange, power shifted quietly from one body to another. It leaves behind the chill of a room where trust loosened its shape beneath candlelight. Another chamber waits with its own delicate tension. And somewhere in that silence, a new whisper is already preparing to reveal more than it should. The bedchamber in Tudor England was a place where truth slipped out with unsettling ease. No council chamber, no privy room. No guarded hallway could compete with the false safety created by dim candlelight and warm sheets. Behind thick curtains and heavy doors, the world outside seemed to dissolve, leaving only two people who believed, foolishly, that affection erased consequence. It was in this softened space, wrapped in shadows, that the most powerful men in the realm revealed themselves without caution. The king, who spent his days measuring every word for political weight, grew strangely unguarded once night settled around him. A mistress, sitting close enough for her sleeve to brush his arm, heard truths that no council would ever be permitted to hear. Titles and protocols vanished. He spoke as though his voice could not possibly slip beyond the bed, as though the woman beside him existed only to absorb his burdens. It was a comforting illusion, and he relied on it more than he intended. In that small, enclosed world, honesty felt harmless. Court gentlemen behaved no differently. When they believed themselves admired or adored, their tongues loosened. They spoke of rivalries, private disagreements, or ambitions not yet spoken aloud. They confessed irritations with the king, or whispered about the growing influence of certain nobles. They shared suspicions, frustrations, and reckless ideas, all under the assumption that the one listening cared too much to ever repeat their words. But care was a fragile thing, and trust even more so. Intimacy blurred judgment. Men mistook attention for devotion and gentleness for loyalty. A mistress learned quickly that silence encouraged confession. The less she asked, the more they offered. She did not need to pry. She needed only to be present. The men assumed she had no interest in politics, that her world revolved solely around affection. They saw her as harmless, and therefore her ears became repositories of secrets that should never have been spoken so freely. A bedchamber was not designed to keep information safe. Doors closed. Yes, but minds opened. A king stripped of his ceremonial layers revealed the man beneath. One who needed comfort, reassurance, or admiration. And in reaching for those comforts, he exposed pieces of the realm's inner workings. The mistress did not need to act like a spy. The environment itself did the work for her. Proximity dissolved restraint. Every whispered name, every muttered grievance, every half-finished confession settled into the quiet space between them. The king rarely remembered what he had said. A mistress always did. She recognized shifts in tone that advisors would never witness. She noticed when a new enemy preoccupied him or when a noble family had begun to irritate him. She also noticed when he tried to hide something. Because attempts to conceal the truth often leaked out more forcefully in intimate spaces. This information did not remain floating in the air. It rooted itself in her awareness, becoming a quiet map of the political terrain she was forced to navigate. She knew who would rise and who would fall before the court did. She recognized when danger approached her position. She sensed when a new favorite threatened her place. And each night, while the king believed he had laid aside the burdens of rule, she gathered the very details that determined her own survival. Other women at court understood this dynamic all too well. Jealousy between wives, consorts, and mistresses did not center only on affection. It centered on access. Whoever spent the most time near the king's quiet moments held the greatest advantage. This was why gifts, letters, and favors circulated so strategically. This was why rival factions attempted to place sympathetic women near him. The bedchamber was the one arena where a woman did not need official permission to influence power. She needed only to remain close. The mistress did not speak openly of what she learned. Her silence protected her far more than her beauty ever could. She had no official capacity, no legal standing, no recognized authority, and yet she held truths that could shift the momentum of court politics. Secrets passed through the air like smoke, light enough to be ignored by the speaker, but heavy enough to reshape the listener's future. Men believed intimacy was a refuge. Women understood it as a corridor through which information traveled freely. The king could be unpredictable in daylight, but in darkness, his guard slipped in ways impossible to control. His words carried the tremor of his uncertainties. His tone revealed anxieties he pretended not to feel. His sighs and pauses exposed the gaps between his desires and his responsibilities. A mistress, lying inches away, learned to read every one of these signs. She listened because listening kept her safe. She remembered because forgetting could cost her everything. And while he believed he was unburdening himself, she was quietly absorbing the material that determined the shape of her future. Intimacy created the illusion of equality. But it was an illusion, only one of them recognized. It lingers like the memory of a room where closeness dissolved, caution and truth drifted without restraint. Another private space waits with its own shifting quiet. And within that quiet, something unspoken is already gathering weight in the dark. They moved through the Tudor court with a softness that disguised the weight of what they carried. Mistresses were rarely seen as political forces. They entered rooms without drawing suspicion. Their presence treated as decoration rather than influence. The men who shaped the kingdom often overlooked them entirely. Assuming that beauty replaced ambition and affection erased awareness. This miscalculation created a space in which information slipped effortlessly into their hands. Power ignored them. And by ignoring them, it exposed itself. No one believed a mistress posed a threat. She held no title, signed no documents, and sat in no council. She was not summoned to negotiations or trusted with official messages. Her position existed between desire and dismissal, a place considered too unstable to allow real influence. Yet that instability made her dangerous differently. Because she was not a formal figure, she was not monitored. She drifted between private and public spaces with an ease unavailable to women of higher station. She overheard much and questioned nothing aloud. Her silence, mistaken for simplicity, allowed her to see everything. A woman without official standing rarely attracted scrutiny. Servants watched nobles. Nobles watched ministers. Ministers watched the king. But who watched the mistress? She lived in a narrow space just outside the court's official hierarchy. She could enter chambers so that others could not. She could linger in corridors where whispered conversations took place. She could walk past closed doors and be dismissed as irrelevant. Each pathway offered fragments of knowledge, and fragments were enough for someone skilled at listening. Her lack of status protected her far more effectively than rank ever could. A noblewoman carried the weight of alliances and expectations. She was observed carefully and judged harshly. A servant carried the risk of punishment. She was expected to remain invisible. But a mistress existed in a strange middle ground. Visible enough to be envied. Invisible enough to be ignored. The court did not know what to make of her, and so it chose not to watch her too closely. That choice left cracks where secrets could pass through. Intimacy concealed deeper purposes. A mistress's closeness to powerful men masked the reality that she was also collecting the emotional debris they scattered carelessly. She could recognize the shift in a man's mood hours before others noticed. She could see guilt tightening his jaw, or ambition quickening his breath. She could hear uncertainty in the way he sat down beside her, or frustration in how he removed his gloves. Even without spoken words, these signals revealed more than advisors could uncover through direct questioning. Men misunderstood this dynamic entirely. They believed that intimacy protected them from scrutiny, that a woman who lay beside them was incapable of judgment. They assumed her affection softened her attention, making her uninterested in anything beyond personal desire. This belief gave her the freedom to watch them without being watched in return. She learned when they lied to others. She learned when they lied to themselves. She learned which secrets weighed heavily on their minds, and which ambitions they did not dare voice publicly. The mistress rarely needed to seek information. Information came to her. A man who felt adored became careless. A man who felt desired became generous with his confessions. A man who felt unthreatened opened the door to truth without realizing he had done so. She simply needed to remain present, quiet, and receptive. Her role in these exchanges was subtle, but its effects were powerful. She listened not with the intent to expose, but with the understanding that knowledge was the only form of protection available to someone in her position. What made her especially effective was not cunning, but necessity without a title. She had no shield. Without legitimacy, she had no guarantee of future security. Every day in the Tudor court carried the possibility of being replaced, discarded, or accused. Information became her lifeline. It allowed her to anticipate danger, to adjust her behavior, or shift alliances before others recognized the change. Knowledge turned survival into strategy. Her observational skill developed naturally. She learned to read conversations she was not part of, to interpret gestures meant for others, to detect tension rising beneath polite words. She became aware of which courtiers favored which factions, which alliances weakened, and which rivalries hardened. She did not participate in these conflicts openly, but she understood them with a clarity many officials lacked. That clarity shaped her actions and preserved her presence in a world where few women were allowed to remain for long. The court believed that influence required recognition. The mistress proved that influence thrived in secrecy. Her power did not come from public declarations or formal acknowledgement. It came from the quiet accumulation of what others dismissed as insignificant. She gathered truth in pieces, and those pieces formed a picture no one else bothered to assemble. As long as powerful men underestimated her, she remained a vessel into which their guarded thoughts poured freely. It settles like the memory of a woman standing unnoticed, while truths drifted toward her unguarded. Another layer of this world waits with its shifting quiet. Within that quiet, something half-hidden is preparing to reveal the cost of being too close to power. Affection in the Tudor court was rarely simple, even when it appeared gentle on the surface. Behind every soft gesture lay an intention shaped by necessity, and behind every moment of closeness stood a woman who understood that survival depended on more than beauty or charm. What men believed to be tenderness was often strategy, carried out with a patience sharpened by the dangers of court life. A mistress had no official standing, no protected future, and no promise of permanence. What she did have was proximity, and she learned quickly how to use it. Care was never random. Each expression of concern, each quiet touch, each softly spoken word was placed with deliberate precision. She did not smother the king with affection. She chose her moments carefully, allowing him to believe he had initiated emotional closeness. In truth, she studied him the same way a court minister studied political rivals. She watched him to understand when he felt uncertain, when his confidence faltered, and when his mind drifted toward matters he could not share publicly. These were the moments when he became receptive, when a small gesture felt like sanctuary, and when she could guide the conversation without appearing to guide anything at all. A well-timed question could open the door to truths he had not intended to reveal. She did not push or provoke. She merely allowed silence to linger until his own thoughts filled the space. Men in power carried burdens too heavy to voice in daylight. At night, when the weight of decisions pressed against their conscience, the presence of someone who listened without judgment felt irresistible. She knew this. She relied on it. A single question, asked, not with urgency, but with softness. He could unravel threads he had tried to hold together. The question was never about politics directly. It was about mood, about tension in his voice, about weariness on his face. Those observations led him to speak, and when he spoke, everything else followed. Her listening became the true instrument of access. She spoke far less than the men who visited her chambers or lay beside her, and that imbalance created an unspoken invitation. The less she said, the more they filled the silence. The less she revealed, the more they exposed. Her restraint became a mirror in which their own thoughts returned to them in unguarded form. What they mistook for empathy was the quiet strength of someone who recognized that words were worth more when spoken freely than when dragged out through force. In court politics, information was currency. For a mistress, information was a lifeline. She never framed her attention as interrogation. She framed it as understanding, as comfort, as the gentle presence of someone who asked nothing but offered everything. This illusion allowed men to let their guard down. A king accustomed to flattery, pressure, and relentless expectation felt an unfamiliar relief when speaking to someone who did not appear to judge him. That relief made him careless. Carelessness made him honest. Her attentiveness carried no hostility. It carried survival. A mistress knew her position lasted only as long as the king found her valuable. Power could shift overnight. Affection could cool without warning. And a single rumor could ruin her. She could not control the court, but she could control how well she understood its movements. Gathering information through emotional closeness became not only instinct but habit. It was the one advantage available to her in a world designed to deny her all others. Even the smallest remarks unlocked larger truths. When he sighed before answering, she sensed hesitation. When he paused, she sensed conflict. When he grew animated, she sensed ambition. Every emotional contour guided her understanding of the political landscape beyond the chamber walls. It did not matter that she held no official role. She held awareness, and awareness was often more powerful than title. Men believed love made them safe. Women knew love made them visible. A mistress who failed to observe risked becoming irrelevant. One who observed too much risked becoming dangerous. Her success lay in the delicate balance between appearing harmless and being unavoidably perceptive. The court saw affection as a weakness. She turned it into a window. Through that window, she watched the kingdom in ways no advisor ever could. She did not manipulate through force or threats. She influenced through presence. She shaped conversations by allowing them to shape themselves. The king revealed himself not because she demanded it, but because she offered the quiet he needed. In that quiet, he misread her silence as devotion. She understood it as an opportunity. Love in the Tudor court did not resemble the love told in poems or painted on tapestries. It carried edges sharpened by uncertainty and shadows cast by ambition. A mistress used affection not to deceive, but to survive. Her listening, her restraint, and her timing formed the unseen tools with which she navigated a world that offered her no rightful place. Every whispered truth arriving at her side was another step towards safety, even if the man speaking it believed he was simply sharing his heart. It fades as the memory of a question asked softly enough to open what should have remained closed. Another layer of closeness waits with its own shifting weight. In that closeness, something fragile is ready to expose the danger hidden behind quiet devotion. Silence, in the Tudor court, could hold more force than any spoken vow. It was not the silence of affection or shyness, but the silence of calculation, an understanding that words carried weight, and that weight could crush the wrong woman without hesitation. A mistress who survived near the king did so not by expressing devotion, but by mastering restraint. She learned early that listening protected her far better than any declaration of loyalty. To speak too much was to risk exposure. To listen well was to stay alive. In a world ruled by shifting alliances, every secret acted as a layer of armor, a whispered grievance, a half-formed plan, a careless confession. Each could be stored quietly in her memory, hidden beneath an appearance of tenderness. The men who shared her company believed they were seeking comfort. They never imagined their words would accumulate into a shield around her. Piece by piece, she did not gather secrets to wield them openly. She gathered them because she had no other defense against the fragility of her position. A mistress lived in constant awareness that affection offered no guarantees. A king's favor might warm her one day and discard her the next. Court factions judged her usefulness with cold precision. Rivals watched for mistakes. Even the queen's household monitored her presence. In such conditions, knowledge became the only stable ground. Without it, she would be swept away by forces larger than her name, her body, or her beauty. Listening was an act of survival long before it became an act of influence. She listened to trace the rise of irritation in the king's tone. She listened to measure the distance between his public composure and his private unrest. She listened for changes in his breathing, for tension in his pauses, for the invisible threads tying him to allies or pulling him toward enemies. Every detail mattered. Every hint offered a small advantage in a world where women like her possessed so few. Men mistook her silence for obedience. They imagined she absorbed their confessions out of love, or softness, or the naive admiration they believed she held for them. But her silence was deliberate. It allowed them to continue speaking, unaware that the very act of confiding made her safer. With each revelation, she became less vulnerable, less expendable, less easy to remove without consequence. A woman who knew nothing could be dismissed quietly. A woman who knew too much could not. Yet the burden of this knowledge was heavy. Secrets safeguarded her, but they also caged her. A mistress who overheard too many truths lived with the ever-present fear that a single misplaced reaction might reveal how much she had noticed. The more she learned, the more carefully she had to move. The court saw danger in women who understood too deeply. Power tolerated their beauty, but distrusted their insight. To survive, she had to wear a mask of gentle ignorance while carrying the sharp awareness of a strategist. This constant balancing act shaped her into someone neither wholly loved nor wholly feared, but quietly indispensable. She became a witness to the private fractures of the realm. Fractures the king himself sometimes refused to acknowledge. When he vented frustrations or unveiled ambitions, He rarely realized that each confession committed him to a vulnerability she alone could see. Her presence, warm and silent, encouraged the release of truths he would never share with his advisors. The tragedy of her role was that her survival depended on an intimacy that placed her in perpetual danger. A mistress who understood too little vanished without notice. A mistress who understood too much risked becoming a threat. She lived in that narrow space between usefulness and fear, gathering secrets not out of ambition but out of necessity. Her listening became a quiet act of defiance against a world designed to erase her. The court believed power spoke loudly, but she learned that true power whispered. It lingered in the soft moments between confessions. It embedded itself in memories no one knew she carried. It shaped her path, not through privilege but through awareness. She did not seek to dominate the king or steer the kingdom. She sought only to avoid being crushed by forces that cared nothing for the women caught in their wake. In the dim light of the bedchamber, she appeared as nothing more than a companion. But beneath that surface, she was something else entirely. A keeper of truths, a quiet observer of fragile egos, a survivor who understood that danger, moved swiftly in silence. The men around her imagined she had no power. They did not realize that by speaking freely, they had placed that power in her hands. It settles like the trace of a woman holding her safety in the quiet things she never says aloud. Another motion of this world stirs beneath the surface of withheld truths. From that shifting space, something concealed is preparing to redefine the limits of what a mistress can endure. Power in the Tudor court rarely moved in straight lines. It drifted through rooms, passed between hands, and flowed quietly along channels that no official record acknowledged. A mistress, positioned close enough to hear what others concealed, became part of this unseen network, whether she intended it or not. Her knowledge did not remain with her alone. It travelled, softly, indirectly, and often without her speaking a single, deliberate word. Influence did not require titles. It required attention, memory, and proximity to those who mattered. Information gathered in moments of intimacy did not end its life in the bedchamber. It continued in motion, carried outward by the people who surrounded her. Ladies in waiting adjusted her gowns, brushed her hair, and overheard fragments of her worries. A trusted maid observed, who visited and who disappeared. A secretary noticed changes in tone when drafting letters she dictated. None of these individuals held authority, but each occupied a position where whispers naturally accumulated. Whether she intended to share or merely allowed her concerns to surface through small shifts in behavior, traces of what she knew reached others. A mistress did not need to issue instructions. She only needed to remember. Those around her, servants who admired her, attendants who depended on her, confidantes who hoped to rise with her. I noticed everything. Their loyalty was often based on survival as well. A maid who sensed a shift in the king's favour might share her worries with another servant. A secretary who detected political tension in the queen's household might bring it to her attention out of caution. The network built itself from necessity, not design. In such an environment, information became fluid. A glance exchanged in a corridor, a name spoken hesitantly, a letter sealed too hastily. These were the signals the network absorbed. It was never formal, never documented, and never spoken of openly. Power lived in what was remembered, not in what was signed. The court ran on memory more than on law, and a woman who remembered well, or surrounded herself with those who did, held influence beyond her social rank. Because the system operated indirectly, it left no proof behind. A mistress might change her expression after hearing the king complain about a nobleman, and her maid would take note. That maid might mention the shift to a footman, who repeated it to a guard, who mentioned it to someone in the kitchens. By the time the observation reached a courtier, it had become a signal of political tension, yet no one could trace its origin. The information moved like smoke, visible in effect, impossible to capture at its source. These pathways of communication were not limited to servants. Sometimes, family members played a role. A sister who visited might carry subtle warnings home. A cousin placed in another noble household might hear rumors and deliver them back quietly. The court was full of people bound by blood, debt, or affection, and every connection created another route through which knowledge could travel. A mistress learned to navigate these ties without appearing to manipulate them. She did not command. She allowed the structure to function around her. Her greatest strength lay in the fact that she never needed to speak explicitly. A single request made with careful softness, a hesitation, a quiet observation, could ripple outward through the network of people who depended on her goodwill. Those who served her listened closely because their fates often folded into hers. If she fell, they fell. If she rose, they rose. Their awareness made them attentive to every shift in her world. This indirect system protected her as well. When the king grew unpredictable or political tension sharpened around her, she often sensed the danger before it arrived. A maid might overhear a conversation between courtiers questioning her influence. A clerk might mention that a rival woman had been summoned more frequently. None of these warnings came in formal announcements. They emerged in passing remarks, hurried whispers, or subtle changes in daily routine. The network worked silently, but it worked constantly. The beauty of such a system was its lack of accountability. No one could accuse her of plotting because she issued no orders. No one could claim she interfered in politics because her hands carried no letters, and her voice made no demands. She functioned as the center of a wheel whose spokes turned without her force. Her role was passive in action but active in awareness, and awareness was the foundation of her survival. The court feared visible power because visible power threatened the established order. Invisible power, however, power that traveled through servants, relatives, and quiet observers, was harder to contain. It evaded the structures designed to monitor and punish. A mistress, even one without ambition, became a conduit for influence, simply by existing in a place where men revealed too much, and the world watched her too closely. What made this network especially effective was its gentleness. It was not aggressive or loud. It moved through everyday routines, a hand adjusting a sleeve, a tray being carried through a corridor, a letter folded with care. Lives intersected constantly within the court, and every intersection produced potential knowledge. The mistress lived at the heart of these interactions, whether she wished to or not. Her survival depended not on force, but on perception, hers and everyone else's. She learned to read the flow of information around her like a map without borders. Each whispered detail, each soft warning, each shift in atmosphere told her what she needed to know. And the court continued unaware that the woman they underestimated understood its movements more deeply than those who believed themselves powerful. It lingers like the quiet trace of messages drifting through hands that never claim them. Another current begins to gather beneath the surface of these hidden exchanges. Out of that current, something sharp is preparing to reveal how observation transforms into control. Surveillance in the Tudor court was not limited to grand moments or whispered confessions in the dark. It lived steadily in the ordinary rhythms of daily life, in the movements of hands, in the rise and fall of breath, in the subtle shifts that passed unnoticed by those who believed themselves concealed. A mistress learned early that danger rarely announced itself. It appeared in small details long before it took larger shape. To survive, she watched the world around her with a quiet precision sharpened by necessity. She observed habits as carefully as a minister studied alliances. A man's morning routine, whether he rose quickly or lingered in bed, revealed the weight pressing on his mind. The way he tightened his belt, chose his gloves, or addressed a servant contained hints of his inner state. A changed pace, a longer pause, a sharper tone. Each became a clue. She recognized these signs with an attention that bordered on instinct. While others saw only the king performing daily tasks, she saw a shifting landscape of moods, frustrations, and decisions forming behind his composure. Anger, especially, betrayed itself long before it erupted. The king's jaw stiffened at dinner. His fingers tapped the table during quiet moments. His voice carried a strain when he spoke of certain nobles. Courtiers might dismiss these as trivial fluctuations, but a mistress understood their meaning. Anger did not appear suddenly. It gathered slowly until it broke. By noticing its earliest tremors, she could anticipate the storm, while others still admired the calm. She also learned to read absence. What the king did not say, where his gaze did not linger, and which subjects he avoided. Silence could be more revealing than speech. When he withdrew inward, she recognized the tightening of secrets. When he softened unexpectedly, she sensed relief from a private fear. These observations allowed her to understand his movements better than the advisors who spent hours discussing policy at his side. They heard his words. She saw what lived beneath them. Her awareness extended beyond the king. She monitored the behavior of courtiers, attendants, and households that orbited around the royal chambers. A nobleman who bowed too deeply might be masking ambition. A lady who looked away too quickly might be hiding knowledge. Even servants, whose presence was often ignored entirely, contributed to signs of shifts within the palace. A hurried step, a nervous glance, a tightened expression. Such details accumulated into a quiet record of the court's emotional climate. Through daily observation, she detected patterns others overlooked. She noticed when the king's patience wore thin, when a faction gained strength, when rumors swelled beneath the surface. These insights did not arrive dramatically. They appeared in fragments, gestures, expressions, and silences that drifted through the corridors like faint warnings. She collected them and formed a picture of what was coming long before anyone announced it aloud. This vigilance was not born from ambition. It was born from vulnerability. A mistress lived on unstable ground, her position shaped by forces far beyond her control. To remain unaware was to be unprepared. She needed to sense threats before they appeared, to brace herself against shifts in the king's favor, to recognize when rival women watched her more closely. Every detail became a safeguard. Every quiet discovery, a means of navigating the uncertainty that defined her existence. Her ability to detect concealed intentions surprised even herself. She could sense when someone approached the king with rehearsed flattery, or when resentment lingered behind a respectful tone. She recognized feigned loyalty as easily as genuine affection, and she understood when someone intended to hide something, not because she knew the secret, but because she saw the effort taken to bury it. Concealment left shadows, and she learned to see them. In time, this constant observation became part of her identity. She could no longer move through the palace without reading it. The doorway was not just a doorway, it was a passage for hurried steps or whispered exchanges. A shared glance between courtiers carried implications that might soon affect her fate. A sudden quiet in the queen's household suggested the brewing of rumors. Nothing remained truly ordinary once she understood how much meaning lived inside everyday moments. To others, she appeared calm, decorative, harmless. They saw her as someone who existed for affection alone. They did not realize that her gaze, quiet and steady, was collecting truths they failed to notice. She watched, not because she wished to expose them, but because she knew that ignorance offered no protection in a place where missteps were punished swiftly. What made her surveillance remarkable was its subtlety. She asked no direct questions and issued no commands. She simply paid attention in a world where most people were too busy protecting themselves to look closely at others. Her knowledge came from lived experience rather than formal power. And because of that, it carried a clarity no official report could match. The court believed observation belonged to advisors, guards, and ministers, but observation belonged most of all to the woman who had the most to lose. She saw the tremors before the quake, the shadows before the change, the movements before the announcement. By watching the daily pulse of the palace, she learned not only what others planned, but what they feared, concealed, or even refused to admit to themselves. It lingers like the trace of a quiet gaze collecting truths hidden inside routine gestures. Another shift begins to form beneath the fragile calm of daily life. From that shift emerges something unspoken, preparing to expose what fear keeps carefully tucked away. The Tudor court drew a sharp, unforgiving line between the Queen and the woman who shared the king's private moments. The Queen lived beneath the weight of ceremony, her every gesture monitored, her every word shaped by duty rather than desire. She moved through halls surrounded by attendants, who recorded her behavior with silent precision. Her life belonged to the realm, not to herself, even in her most private hours. The expectations of royalty clung to her like a second skin. There was no moment without an audience, no breath taken without implication. A queen's image was constructed carefully. Part symbole, part sacrifice. She embodied lineage, legitimacy, and continuity. Her expressions were studied by ambassadors. Her posture was judged by courtiers. Her alliances were scrutinized by the kingdom. Her proximity to the king was political, not intimate. When she spoke to him, she carried the voices of nations and families behind her. She was trained to comfort him publicly, never to expose vulnerability privately. Her duty was to represent stability, even when her own world trembled. A mistress entered a different world entirely. She stood outside the ceremony, outside the scrutiny, outside the suffocating rigidity that governed the Queen's life. She had no throne to uphold, no alliances to maintain, no lineage to protect. In many ways, she had nothing, and because she had nothing, she could move where the Queen could not. The king came to her not for diplomacy, but for release. He approached her without armor, without expectation, without the rehearsed dignity he wore before the world. The distance between them was smaller, the air less rigid, the truth harder to disguise. Her greatest access came in moments stripped of formality. She saw the king when he removed the symbols of his authority, when he loosened his voice and allowed exhaustion to surface. She witnessed the hesitation in his eyes before he made decisions that would never reach the Queen's chambers. She heard the fear concealed beneath his confidence, the doubts buried beneath his proclamations. These were the moments the Queen was never permitted to see. The ceremony demanded a polished king. Intimacy revealed the fractured man beneath. Because of this access, the mistress accumulated knowledge through unguarded exposure. She learned the contours of the king's moods, the tilt of his thoughts, the drift of his loyalties. A queen might hear official news from ministers. A mistress sensed private truths from the tremor in his breath. The queen understood the kingdom. The mistress understood the man who ruled it. Yet the mistress was not freer than the queen, only differently confined. Her insight was born from a precarious position, one that could collapse with a whisper. She could not demand answers or challenge decisions. Her power came from seeing, not shaping. The queen operated within a rigid structure. The mistress navigated an invisible one. Both were trapped, but only one was underestimated enough to witness what others missed. The contrast sharpened each time the king crossed the threshold between their worlds. With the queen, he performed. With the mistress, he unraveled. She witnessed his indecision when the crown weighed too heavily. She recognized the names that made him clench his jaw, the alliances that thinned his patience, the betrayals that carved deeper lines into his face. These details did not appear in official reports. They appeared in the quiet spaces where kings forgot to pretend. The queen's knowledge was formal, polished, and political. She understood what the realm expected. She understood the structures that shaped its governance. She knew the consequences of diplomatic missteps and the dangers of public scandal. The mistress, meanwhile, understood the king's heart. Not its warmth, but its fractures. She knew which fears kept him awake, which ambitions made him reckless, and which insecurities drove him toward cruelty or mercy. That understanding, though unofficial, was dangerously powerful. A queen received information through channels shaped by protocol. A mistress received information through the tremor of a sigh, the subtle tightening of a hand, the softness he reserved for moments he hoped no one else would witness. One woman held the crown beside him, the other held the shadows he tried to hide from it. Between them lay the difference between public order and private unraveling. Because the mistress witnessed the king without defences, she often understood the direction of political shifts before anyone else. Ministers waited for proclamations. She anticipated them from the restless way he paced the chamber. Factions guessed at his dissatisfaction. She sensed it from the edge in his voice. The queen upheld the kingdom's image. The mistress interpreted its ruler's impulses. This difference shaped the delicate balance of power around the king. While the queen stood visibly beside him, the mistress existed in the quiet corners where truth slipped through. And in those corners, she learned far more than the world assumed she could. It settles like the quiet recognition that two women occupied the same palace, yet lived beside entirely different versions of the same man. Another presence draws nearer, beneath the dim light of private influence. Out of that presence rises a truth, ready to expose how unspoken knowledge begins to shape the court itself. Love in the Tudor court created illusions far stronger than truth. A king might give his affection freely, believing the warmth of intimacy to be a sign of trust. But trust was rarely what it appeared to be. Affection flowed effortlessly in private moments. Yet real faith in another person required vulnerability, a quality he rarely afforded anyone. Even the woman he loved most was not necessarily the woman he trusted. Trust, for him, existed not in passion but in habit, in instinct, in the unexamined patterns he repeated without noticing. And because it was unconscious, it could shift without warning. A mistress often mistook the king's tenderness for confidence. He came to her when he was weary, when he wanted relief from the weight of political pressure. When he sought reassurance, he could not request from the queen or his ministers. She heard his confessions, his doubts, his anger, and the thousand insecurities buried beneath his crown. She believed that such revelations signaled closeness. But closeness did not equal reliance. He revealed himself not because he trusted her, but because he needed an outlet for frustrations he could not voice elsewhere. Real control belonged to the one who observed, rather than the one who felt loved. The mistress, by listening, gained insights into the king's private contradictions, those hidden fractures between his public role and his private self. She noticed when he grew uncertain about his advisors, when he feared the rise of a noble family, when his temper sharpened at the mention of a particular courtier. These details were invisible to the men who served him, yet they shaped the direction of his choices long before he announced them. The king did not recognize that he was offering her this power. He believed he was simply unburdening himself. But each word he spoke in the sanctuary of familiarity became something she could use, if only to navigate the precariousness of her own existence. She learned to distinguish genuine emotion from performance. She traced the patterns in his speech. She understood his tendencies toward exaggeration, denial, and sudden shifts of mood. In watching him, she learned how to protect herself. Love, however, blinded him. A mistress's soft presence, her willingness to listen, her apparent devotion, all of it made him feel seen in ways the court never allowed. Yet it was this feeling of being understood that made him careless. He confused comfort with security, mistaking her silence for loyalty rather than strategy. In doing so, He placed himself within the gaze of someone who knew far more about him than he realized. The Queen, ministers, and courtiers all sought influence through visible means: alliances, speeches, and formal gestures. The mistress's influence worked differently. It was invisible, formed in the space where affection met perception. She did not need authority to shape her environment. She needed only to understand the man at its center, and because she saw him when he believed no one else was watching. She possessed knowledge no official relationship could grant. Yet the mistress knew better than to mistake this knowledge for security. The more she understood, the more fragile her position became. A woman who knew too much could be quietly removed, blamed, or discarded. She could not speak openly of what she observed. She could only adjust her behavior, anticipating his reactions and avoiding his anger. Her insight granted her leverage, but it also forced her into a constant state of caution. Power gained in silence demanded survival in silence. Meanwhile, the king could not grasp the disparity between love and trust. He assumed affection made him safe. In truth, affection made him transparent. The person who loved him saw the man beneath the crown. The man burdened by insecurity, indecision, and longing for admiration. She recognized his contradictions with clarity that frightened her. Love softened him, observation revealed him. She held both roles, and holding both meant she navigated a dangerous line between intimacy and influence. The tragedy of this dynamic was that the king believed he controlled the relationship. He imagined himself the giver of affection, access, or favor, and privilege. But the mistress, positioned to witness his unguarded self, held a deeper understanding of him than he held of her. He loved openly. She watched quietly. He revealed. She interpreted. Love made him vulnerable, while her watchfulness shaped the boundaries of their world. In a court where betrayal was common and secrets traveled faster than truth, trust rarely aligned with affection. The king felt safest with the one he adored. Yet safety and emotional closeness did not translate to political judgment. The mistress occupied the space where love obscured the king's perception, where he believed he saw clearly, while she saw through him more easily than anyone else. Love clouded his judgment. Power sharpened hers. The imbalance defined their relationship more profoundly than the affection that tied them together. He loved her, but love did not grant insight. She watched him, and watching granted everything. It settles like the quiet realization that devotion reveals more than loyalty ever could. Another tension begins to pulse beneath the surface of shifting affections. Out of that tension, something hidden edges, closer to exposing the cost of knowing too much. The mistress became an informal witness to the movements of the Tudor court long before anyone recognized her role. She did not hold a seal or a title, yet she absorbed more unpolished, unfinished truth than the ministers who surrounded the king each morning. Plans that appeared complete in the council chamber often began as half-formed thoughts spoken in her presence. The king, relaxing into the comfort of a familiar voice and a familiar touch, revealed fragments of strategy in a way that felt harmless to him. He did not intend to speak of diplomacy, taxation, or rebellion. The words simply slipped out while he tried to untangle his thoughts aloud. She heard them all. These unfinished plans were more revealing than final decisions. They showed hesitation, fear, ambition, and the quiet doubts the king refused to acknowledge publicly. Advisors received conclusions. She received origins. She listened as he tested ideas without committing to them, complaining about obstacles before announcing solutions, whispering names he had not yet confronted. Such moments let her see where his mind was drifting, even before he knew where it was heading. She became the first to detect patterns forming beneath his uncertainty. From these murmured beginnings, she could sense the shifts in his favor, long before the court felt them. The king's affections were rarely stable, and his temper shaped political outcomes as quickly as formal decrees. A slight change in his mood toward a nobleman, a brief pause before speaking the man's name, a tightening of his breath, signaled a withdrawal of grace. A spark of enthusiasm during a casual remark hinted at a rising favourite. Courtiers spent months misreading the king's subtle alterations in tone. She detected them instantly. She watched the ebb and flow of his attachments, the same way others watched the seasons. A man who once visited the palace daily might suddenly stop appearing. Another might receive unexpected invitations. These changes rarely came with announcements. They manifested as small adjustments in the king's behaviour. Details too minor for the council, but unmistakable to the woman who saw him in the hours when he softened into honesty. Through such glimpses, she recognized the fragile nature of influence in the Tudor court. Influence did not fall suddenly. It dissolved, drop by drop. Her ability to predict ascents and declines was not rooted in ambition, but in observation. She learned to sense the tremor in the court's atmosphere, the tightening in servants' movements, the shift in conversations that passed through corridors. She did not need direct information. People carried news in the way they walked, spoke, and waited. Even silence revealed more than those in power understood. A household unsettled by rumour moved differently than one confident in its standing. The mistress occupied a dangerous position in this landscape. She was close enough to the king to hear what others missed, yet far enough from formal authority to be blamed if her awareness threatened someone's ambition. She understood the kingdom not through proclamations, but through glimpses, fragments that formed a map of rising tensions. Ministers strategized by analyzing documents. She strategized by watching the king fall quiet after certain names were mentioned. Even the smallest details became signals. The king delaying a letter he had previously been eager to send, taking longer to dress on mornings, following a difficult decision, or cutting short a conversation during which a noble's loyalty was questioned. She gathered these pieces without appearing to gather anything. Observation did not require permission, and she carried no visible tools. Her mind became the ledger in which the truth of the realm was recorded. One of the most unsettling realities for her was knowing that the court's stability could shift while she lay beside the king in silence. At night, he might reveal frustration with a long-trusted advisor. By morning, that advisor's fortunes had begun to decline without anyone realizing why. She understood how swiftly favor could collapse and how quietly a kingdom could rearrange itself. She learned to anticipate the consequences long before they unfolded publicly. Her insight created a strange kind of foresight. She knew which men would rise to prominence before they received the king's summons. She recognized the weakening of alliances days before courtiers whispered about them. She sensed danger approaching households that believed themselves secure. To her, the court resembled a vast tapestry woven from gestures, moods, and unspoken fears. She saw its threads shifting even when the tapestry appeared unchanged to everyone else. Yet she carried this knowledge alone. She could not warn anyone, for doing so would expose how much she truly understood. A mistress who revealed too much risked accusations that could destroy her. Power expected her to remain decorative, not perceptive, so she held her observations in quiet tension, letting them guide only her own decisions. Her survival depended not on shaping the world, but on reading it with a precision born from necessity. While others believed the king was unpredictable, she recognized the rhythm beneath his choices, his emotional patterns, his moments of hesitation, his bursts of certainty. They formed a sequence she had learned to interpret. To the court, she was a companion. To the king, she was a refuge. But in reality, she was the closest thing the Tudor palace had to an informal observer, a woman who heard what was unfinished, noticed what was shifting, and understood what was coming. It settles like the trace of a quiet witness who sees change long before it is spoken aloud. Another undercurrent begins to form beneath the fragile glow of private confession. Through that undercurrent rises something darker, preparing to expose how information becomes leverage in the shadows of the court. Secrets in the Tudor court were never simply pieces of knowledge. They were currency, fragile and volatile, capable of preserving a life or ending one. For a mistress, information became the only shield she could hold, the only tool she could use without exposing her intentions. She learned early that survival depended not on beauty or affection, but on the careful management of what she knew. Each secret held a different weight, and choosing when to speak, or when not to, shaped the boundary between safety and ruin. Protecting herself meant holding back the details that could make her vulnerable. A careless remark, repeated by the wrong listener, could brand her a threat. A misunderstanding of timing could turn her into a rival rather than a confidant. She knew that the court watched her even when it pretended not to. Every glance, every silence, every shift in her expression risked being interpreted as a sign of alignment with a faction she had no intention of joining. So she learned restraint. Words became measured offerings rather than spontaneous responses. Keeping a secret was not simple preservation, it was negotiation in stillness. She understood that her silence could create an illusion of loyalty, a quiet promise that she would not betray what she observed. The king mistook her restraint for devotion, believing that his confessions were safe with her because she cared for him. But caring had nothing to do with it. Silence was the only armor that did not draw suspicion. Yet there were moments when revealing part of a truth, never all of it, could buy her safety. A well-placed comment, a hint that she had heard something concerning, sometimes redirected danger away from her. She never spoke directly, never acted as if she possessed more knowledge than appropriate. Instead, she guided conversations subtly, allowing others to draw their own conclusions. Letting men believe they had uncovered something themselves was often more effective than exposing the truth outright. She offered pieces, never the full picture. Selective disclosure became a form of calculation. She learned to gauge the value of information by watching reactions, by sensing which fears lingered beneath the surface. If the king seemed unsettled, she chose words that soothed rather than alarmed. If a courtier's ambition threatened her position, she revealed just enough to cast doubt on his reliability without attaching herself to the accusation. She practiced this balance until it felt instinctive, though it never truly became comfortable. Every exchange carried risk. Even more dangerous than speaking was knowing when to remain silent. Silence could shift the balance of a room more sharply than a declaration. By withholding information, she could delay decisions, redirect attention, or simply protect herself from becoming tangled in alliances she neither desired nor trusted. Silence was not absence. It was a presence shaped by caution. The court interpreted silence as obedience, but she knew better. Silence kept her invisible in the moments visibility could kill her. In these choices, she walked a narrow line between influence and exposure. Too many secrets made her threatening. Too few made her disposable. Information had to be managed with the precision of a blade, sharp enough to defend, controlled enough not to wound the wrong person. She felt this tension each time she listened to the king speak of ministers he no longer trusted, nobles he feared, and decisions he had not yet announced. Every word he shared could become a shield or a trap, depending on how she held it. Her knowledge reshaped her identity. She was no longer merely a companion in the private chambers. She was someone who carried fragments of the kingdom's future before they materialized. Ministers envied this access without ever acknowledging it. Queens feared it quietly, knowing that the mistress saw the king in states of vulnerability they never witnessed. Courtiers speculated endlessly, but overlooked the person who understood the shifts in political wind long before they felt its chill. And yet, the mistress gained no official recognition for this role. She operated outside the structures of authority, bound by unpredictability rather than power. Her influence remained unspoken, fragile, constantly at risk of collapse. She survived by handling information with the same care others handled weapons. Her skill lay not in controlling the court, but in preventing the court from controlling her. In the end, bargaining with secrets defined her existence. She learned to fear what she knew, as much as what she did not. She understood that every whisper carried weight, that every silence carried consequence, and that her life balanced delicately on the edge of other people's ignorance. It settles like the quiet understanding that knowledge never arrives without a price. Another tension begins to breathe beneath the stillness of unspoken truths. By that tension rises a sharper presence, preparing to reveal how a role with no orders can still become a weapon of survival. No one in the Tudor court ever told a mistress to watch, to listen, or to gather what others tried to hide. Yet the role formed around her with quiet inevitability, shaped by the circumstances she could not escape. She was placed at the center of a world that traded in suspicion, where every gesture carried meaning and every silence concealed intention. Even without instruction, she learned to observe because observation became the only form of protection available to her. The court taught her nothing directly, but its dangers taught her everything. Her position was precarious from the moment she caught the king's eye. Favor elevated her, but favor could vanish as quickly as it appeared. She lived inside an unstable space, admired in private, dismissed in public, tolerated in politics, yet blamed for outcomes she never controlled. In such a world, survival depended on sensing danger before it approached. She learned to study the rhythm of footsteps in corridors, to note which servants whispered too softly, to read tension in the king's jaw, long before anyone else detected his anger. Watching became instinct. No one labeled her a spy, but she functioned as one because she existed where truth slipped free of ceremony. Ministers brought polished reports. She heard the fragments beneath them. Courtiers bragged of loyalty. She noticed the flicker of doubt in their movements. Visitors spoke in rehearsed tones. She caught the hesitation between their sentences. Her life unfolded in the background of every conversation. Yet she heard more precisely than those who stood at the center. Her role demanded no uniform, no parchment, no seal. It shaped itself out of necessity. The king's moods could shift with unsettling speed, and those shifts determined her safety. If he grew restless, she prepared for distance. If he grew cold, she braced for replacement. If he grew threatened, she risked becoming a scapegoat. The only defense against unpredictability was knowledge. Knowledge acquired through observations so subtle that even she barely noticed when it became habit. Presence taught her more than speech. A prolonged silence beside the king hinted at tension with his ministers. A restless night meant conflict was brewing somewhere in the palace. A sudden change in servants' behavior signaled rumors forming outside her chamber. The patterns seemed small, insignificant, but she read them with the sharpness of someone who understood that her life depended on seeing meaning where others saw nothing. When no one gives orders, the world itself becomes the instruction. She learned that information did not need to be pursued aggressively. It drifted toward her through overheard conversations, quiet confessions, and accidental remarks. People spoke freely around her because they assumed she held no influence, no ambition, no ability to understand the intricacies of politics. Their dismissal granted her access. Their underestimation granted her clarity. In pretending, she knew nothing. She learned nearly everything. Her awareness became a silent map of the palace. She could sense shifts in alliances before they were announced, feel tensions rising before they erupted, and recognize the faint tremors that preceded scandal. Ministers reacted to events. She anticipated them. Courtiers strategized over possibilities. She interpreted inevitabilities. No order directed her actions. Yet she served as an invisible pulse reader of the court, detecting the smallest disruptions before they grew into storms. But this unspoken role carried a burden. She could never reveal how much she understood. A mistress who appeared too aware risked being labeled manipulative. A mistress who listened too closely risked being accused of plotting. She walked a tightrope between invisibility and insight, forced to pretend blindness while navigating dangers that required sharp vision. Her survival relied on balancing knowledge with silence, awareness with feigned ignorance. The court believed spies were men with coded letters, hidden daggers, and secret meetings. But the most effective observer was the woman who stood quietly beside the king as he removed the weight of his crown. She listened not as a conspirator, but as someone with no other choice. She watched not to control others, but to avoid being controlled. Her role required no formal task, no allegiance, no training. It emerged because danger surrounded her, and danger rewards those who see it before it arrives. She became a spy not by intention but by survival. The court shaped her into one without ever acknowledging her existence. She understood that staying alive meant watching everything, closely, constantly, without appearing to watch at all. It settles like the quiet truth that vigilance grows naturally where fear has taken root. Another shadow begins to lengthen at the edge of her awareness. Through that shadow rises a greater danger, preparing to reveal how blurred the boundary becomes between survival and betrayal. No formal recognition ever marked the work a Tudor mistress performed in silence. No medals, no recorded honours, no acknowledgement carved into stone. Yet every day she existed inside a world that demanded the precision of a spy and punished the slightest misstep with complete erasure. She received no instructions, no guidance, and no protection. All she had was her memory, unwritten, uncelebrated, and the caution that kept her alive in a court where one careless moment could end everything. The court loved titles, but her role remained nameless. Ministers carried seals, ambassadors carried documents, soldiers carried weapons. She carried nothing visible, but she learned to safeguard fragments of conversations the way others guarded steel. The king's murmurs, the courtier's whispers, the servants' hurried footsteps. All of it formed a kind of quiet archive inside her mind. She replayed these pieces at night, arranging them into a map of risks and shifting loyalties. No one taught her to do this. The palace itself forced the habit upon her. Her memory became her only reliable tool. The court forgot quickly, but she did not have that luxury. Every detail mattered, a sudden change in the queen's routine, a nobleman's forced smile, a minister's trembling hand when he presented a letter. She learned that danger rarely arrived loudly. It surfaced in subtle alterations, in the cracks that appeared long before anyone else noticed the walls collapsing. Remembering these signs meant survival. Forgetting them meant ruin. Tun Trong shaped every movement she made. She avoided reacting too quickly, avoiding lingering too long in the wrong corridor, avoided asking questions that could mark her as curious. A mistress who appeared too alert threatened the men who believed they understood the court, so she crafted a veneer of softness, gentle eyes, quiet steps, a demeanour that suggested she floated through palace life without grasping its currents. Beneath that surface, she listened with a sharpness honed through necessity, not ambition. The danger she faced was unique. Officials caught lying might lose favour. She caught knowing too much could lose everything. A single slip, a misplaced comment, a glance held seconds too long, could be interpreted as evidence of manipulation. The court had little patience for women who seemed aware of their own power. A mistress who revealed too much understanding risked being dismissed, disgraced, or quietly removed. Survival required careful restraint, the ability to appear harmless while seeing more than she admitted. That tension defined her days. Every conversation held two layers, what was spoken and what she must never reveal she understood. She navigated these dualities with the instinct of someone who knew she walked a narrow path. The court assumed she was there, only to comfort the king. The truth was far darker. Comfort was the currency that bought her proximity, Watchfulness was the cost she paid for remaining there. No one praised her for this labor. Her vigilance was invisible, her insight unacknowledged. While men performed grand acts of loyalty before the king, she performed the quiet work of staying one step ahead of a world eager to discard her the moment she faltered. She learned to move with a caution that masked itself as grace. She learned to speak with a softness that disguised her clarity. She learned to hold secrets that could damage powerful men, though she never dared use them unless cornered. The harshest truth was that one mistake, just one, could erase years of careful survival. A slip of the tongue, a confidential remark overheard by the wrong servant, a misunderstood expression during a tense moment with the king. Any of these could mark her as dangerous. And the court had no patience for dangerous women. She would be removed. Perhaps quietly, perhaps violently, but always decisively. The palace did not tolerate uncertainty, and a mistress with too much knowledge embodied the greatest uncertainty of all. She was never officially appointed, but the court made her into a spy simply by placing her in proximity to power and denying her any protection. She watched because she had to. She remembered because forgetting could destroy her. She interpreted every shift in the king's mood because his displeasure could collapse her world faster than any political crisis. In a palace built on hierarchy, she occupied the lowest position with the highest risk. Her work left no trail, no record, no recognition. Only the silent truth that she survived by performing tasks no one acknowledged she was performing. The court never named her a spy. But that changed nothing. She lived like one because the alternative was unthinkable. It settles like the stark realization that a role unspoken can still demand absolute precision. Another unease begins to stir beneath the surface of her guarded calm. Along with that unease rises the chilling truth of how blurred affection becomes when love and calculation share the same breath. Affection inside the Tudor court never existed in a pure state. It bent and twisted under pressure, reshaped by fear, desire, and necessity, until even the people living inside it could no longer tell where sincerity ended and calculation began. A mistress entered the king's world believing she understood her own heart, but proximity to power blurred every feeling, every touch. Every moment, she thought, belonged only to intimacy. Emotion and strategy intertwined so quietly that she could not separate them, even when she tried. The king approached her, seeking relief from the performance that governed his public life. In those private hours, he appeared softer, almost fragile. He rested his head in her lap, allowed his voice to tremble, and confessed frustrations he would deny in daylight. To him, this felt like love, unvarnished, uncomplicated, but she saw the truth beneath it. He opened himself because she posed no obvious threat. After all, the court had not taught him to fear a woman without a title, whether he loved her or simply needed her. Even he could not fully distinguish. For her, the confusion grew deeper. She felt the pull of intimacy, the warmth of his rare gentleness, the comfort of being the one he sought when exhaustion weakened him. Yet love did not erase the knowledge that her survival relied on reading him accurately. She listened with her heart and her caution at the same time. When he held her hand, she felt tenderness when he sighed heavily. She listened for the meaning within it. She could not surrender her awareness, even when she longed to. There were nights when she believed she truly cared for him. His laugh, softened by candlelight, made her want to forget the dangers around her. His trust, misunderstood as it often was, felt like a gift. But even in those moments, calculation appeared like a shadow behind her affection. She could not help noticing the weight in his voice, the implication of a name, the tremble of hesitation that signaled conflict in the council. She learned to recognize that her heart could move toward him while her mind moved elsewhere. The court encouraged this confusion. It rewarded emotion only when it served politics. A mistress who loved honestly risked becoming blind. A mistress who manipulated too openly risked being destroyed. She had to remain suspended between the two, tender enough to soothe the king, sharp enough to protect herself. This balance became a condition she never consciously chose, but one that wrapped itself around her life until she no longer remembered another way of being. Over time, she discovered that the king blurred the boundary too. He loved her when she eased his loneliness, but he expected usefulness without naming it. Her presence quieted his insecurities, tempered his fears, softened his anger. But he also relied on her subtle observations. He did not ask for them. He simply assumed them. When she offered insight, he believed it came from affection. When she stayed silent, he believed it came from deference. Both interpretations were wrong, yet she could not correct him. His misunderstanding was the only space in which she could survive. She began to see how the role consumed her. What started as careful observation for safety slowly became habit. Then, instinct. She watched him not only when she needed to, but because she no longer knew how to stop. Every breath he took in tension. Every shift in his gaze. Every moment of hesitation became part of the private map she carried of him. The depth of her understanding frightened her. It felt too intimate, too exposed, as though she saw pieces of his soul he never intended anyone to witness. This intimacy created an illusion stronger than the truth. Sometimes she mistook the closeness of their bodies for the closeness of their hearts. Sometimes he mistook her attentiveness for devotion. Both were wrong, and both were right. Their connection existed in a place where honesty and necessity blended until neither could name the difference. She cared, but she also calculated. He trusted, but he also used. They lived inside a bond shaped as much by fear as by affection. Eventually, she realized the most unsettling truth. She was becoming the role she had once feared. The caution that guided her steps hardened into instinct. The emotional distance she used to protect herself carved into her heart. The tenderness she offered him grew quieter because she knew how dangerous unrestrained feeling could be. She adapted to survive, but adaptation changed her. She could not return to the woman she had been before the palace remade her. The boundary between love and advantage dissolved not because she wanted it to, but because the court demanded it. The palace turned affection into currency and vulnerability into risk. To live, she had to blend sincerity with strategy until both tasted the same. Her emotions became a tool she wielded with trembling hands, even when she wished they could remain untouched by calculation. And still, somewhere, in the quiet moments, she wondered whether she loved him or merely needed him. She wondered whether he cherished her or simply relied on her presence. She wondered whether the bond between them meant something real, or whether it was only another fragile invention of a world where survival felt indistinguishable from connection. It settles, like the faint ache of realizing that the heart and the mind no longer walk separate paths. Another shift stirs beneath the surface of this fragile entanglement. Within that shift rises a truth waiting to reveal how even knowledge itself becomes dangerous when emotion is finally stripped away. There came a moment in every mistress's life when the weight of her knowledge stopped feeling like protection and began to feel like a quiet blade resting against her throat. At first, information seemed like a shield, something she could use to anticipate danger, read the king's moods, and navigate the unpredictability of the Tudor court. But as the fragments accumulated, as whispered confessions tangled with overheard threats, she began to sense the darker truth. The more she understood, the more precarious her existence became. Knowledge did not remain passive. It shifted inside her, pressing against the limits of what she could safely hold. She knew which ministers were losing favour before anyone else did. She knew which noblemen plotted too boldly, which alliances were fraying, which secrets the king feared most. These truths were never meant to linger inside one woman who held no formal authority. They burned quietly, threatening to reveal themselves through a careless expression or a mistimed silence. and she understood that if she ever exposed what she heard, even accidentally, she would not be forgiven. Information in the Tudor palace was not neutral. It carried the potential to protect her in one moment and destroy her in the next. If she remembered too clearly, she risked appearing manipulative. If she forgot at the wrong time, she risked seeming unhelpful or disloyal. Every piece of truth became a burden she had to manage, with delicate precision. Forgetting became as important as remembering. Yet neither came easily. Her mind became a locked chamber she feared to open too wide. In the king's presence, the danger intensified. He shared pieces of himself without understanding the power of what he confessed. When he spoke in frustration, she heard the names he feared. When he whispered in exhaustion, she heard the doubts he hid from his counsel. When he vented his anger, she heard the seeds of decisions that would soon alter the structure of the court. And as she listened, a quiet terror formed beneath her calm exterior. One misplaced reaction could betray how much she truly knew. She began to measure her breath around him, choosing every gesture with care. If she reacted too strongly, he might suspect she was interpreting him. If she reacted too weakly, he might believe she was indifferent. She walked between these extremes, performing a balance that felt increasingly impossible. His vulnerability made her powerful, but her awareness made her fragile. She understood him more deeply than anyone else did. Yet understanding him placed her in greater danger than ignorance ever could. Fear threaded itself into her daily life. She feared the servants who might overhear her. She feared the courtiers who watched her movements too closely. She feared the queen's silent recognition of her presence. But most of all, she feared the king's realization that she understood him too well. Men in power rarely tolerated those who saw their weaknesses clearly. Affection could soften him, but fear could erase her. Rumors whispered through the palace. Stories of women who had known too much. Women who disappeared quietly. Women whose names were never spoken again. Women whose memories lingered only as warnings. No one admitted these stories were true. Yet everyone behaved as if they were. She carried those warnings inside her like a second heartbeat, reminding her that survival depended on concealing the very knowledge she relied upon. The burden of choice haunted her. Every day, she questioned what she should hold on to and what she should let slip away. Some truths were too volatile to keep, others too dangerous to forget. She learned to bury certain pieces of information so deeply that even she struggled to retrieve them. But forgetting did not free her. It only added another layer to the fear that shaped her existence. Trythuk never walked alone. It travelled with anxiety, with cautious glances, with tightened breath. The court believed she lived in comfort and luxury. They did not see the nights when she lay awake beside the king, listening to him breathe while she calculated the consequences of every word spoken that day. They did not see the tension in her hands, the quiet tremor she concealed when she realized the depth of what she knew. Eventually, she understood that knowledge had become its own kind of prison. She could not shed it, and she could not use it safely. It lived inside her as both weapon and threat, offering survival while promising danger. Her awareness no longer felt like clarity. It felt like a shadow she could never outrun. To know was to risk, and she knew too much. It settles like the cold recognition that truth is sharpest when carried in silence. Another quiet tremor begins to move beneath her, carefully guarded restraint. Through that tremor rises the warning that even caution may fail when the court decides a woman's knowledge has become too deep. Silence became the most reliable weapon a mistress could wield inside the Tudor court. Precisely because it appeared to be nothing at all. Words left traces. Reactions revealed intent. And curiosity invited scrutiny. But silence slipped safely through corridors, lingering without accusation or interpretation. Over time, she discovered that quietness was not merely the absence of speech. It was a deliberate act of survival, a shield sharpened by caution and necessity. She learned to stay still when information drifted toward her, offering no sign that she recognized its value. In rooms where others leaned forward to catch whispers, she held her posture steady, letting the noise pass over her as though she had not noticed it at all. This restraint protected her more effectively than any alliance. The court punished women who appeared too perceptive, too knowing, too involved. But a woman who seemed passive moved freely, unnoticed, untouched by suspicion. Not reacting became an art. When the king spoke of tension within his council, she let her gaze remain soft, showing neither surprise nor understanding. When courtiers argued in hallways within earshot, she kept her expression calm, never granting them the satisfaction of seeing a reaction to their schemes. She learned that every raised eyebrow, every sharp inhale, every flicker of concern could be interpreted as evidence of knowledge she was not meant to possess. By remaining unreadable, she denied the court any foothold for accusation. Silence also protected her from asking questions she could not afford to ask. Curiosity was dangerous in a palace where information moved like a weapon. A single misplaced inquiry could reveal that she understood the stakes more deeply than expected. So she listened without probing. She let gaps remain unfilled, let contradictions pass unchallenged. Her restraint made her appear harmless. But beneath that surface, she pieced together what she needed from fragments no one realized she had collected. The hardest form of silence was the silence of pretending not to know. She often recognized danger before anyone else did. The shift in a minister's tone, the tightening in the king's jaw, the subtle unease in the servants who carried messages through the palace. She saw alliances fraying quietly, saw ambitions sharpening behind closed doors. But she also understood that acknowledging this awareness would expose her. So she masked her insight behind a softness that misled those around her. Pretending ignorance became a daily performance. When someone mentioned a name she knew was falling out of favor, she let her face remain neutral. When a noble woman spoke with false confidence about her family's influence, she offered a polite nod, never revealing that she had heard the king's frustrations the night before. She hid her knowledge with steady breaths and downcast eyes, letting others believe she drifted through palace life, untouched by its complexities. This performance weighed on her. It demanded constant vigilance, constant self-control. She had to monitor her own reactions as carefully as she monitored the court. A slip of expression could unravel months of quiet stability. She learned to silence her fear, silence hair, irritation, and silence, even her compassion, when speaking might endanger her. Silence became a second skin, one she wore with the grace of someone who understood she could not remove it without consequence. Yet silence was not passivity. Behind it, she analyzed, interpreted, and prepared. She anticipated danger by watching the smallest gestures. The king's restless pacing, the queen's forced smile, the servant's hurried footsteps. She survived not by speaking, but by observing with a precision no one expected from her. Silence allowed her to move through the palace like a shadow, gathering truths that others overlooked. It made her invisible in a world where visibility invited destruction. The contradiction was sharp. Silence protected her, but it isolated her. She could not confide her fears, could not share her insight, could not reveal her understanding without risking everything. She lived beside the king, yet could not speak freely. She walked among courtiers, yet could not lower her guard. Silence became a refuge and a prison, offering safety at the cost of connection. Still, she embraced it. She had no choice. In a court where noise invited danger and truth carried risk, silence offered the closest thing to control. Her quietness shaped the edges of her existence, protecting her from the chaos swirling around her while allowing her to navigate it with deliberate caution. She survived because she said nothing. It settles like the recognition that quietness can carve a path sharper than any spoken plan. Another stillness begins to gather beneath the weight of her restraint. Within that stillness rises the unsettling reminder that even silence cannot shield her forever when power begins to shift again. Love inside the Tudor palace never resembled tenderness as the world imagined it. Affection came wrapped in scrutiny. Softened gestures carried silent evaluations. And every intimate moment held the tension of someone trying to understand the person beside them before that person could become a threat. A mistress learned quickly that closeness did not free her from observation. It sharpened it. Love became another form of watching. Another way to read the shifting currents beneath the king's carefully controlled exterior. When he touched her hand, she felt more than warmth. She felt the weight of his mood pressed into that simple contact. A lingering hold might signal confidence, while a hurried release might hint at irritation. Even the way his thumb traced her palm revealed whether he was unsettled or distracted. These moments, small and deceptively gentle, became signals she interpreted with the precision of someone who understood that affection could turn cold without warning. She watched him even as she leaned into him, studying the subtle changes in his breath that told her more than his spoken words ever could. Every word he shared became a piece of a larger pattern she had to assemble. Even casual remarks revealed which advisers he considered loyal, which nobles stirred distrust, and which decisions tormented him. She listened with an attentiveness born not only of care but of caution. She remembered everything: the tone he used when mentioning a name, the pauses that revealed hesitation, the low mutter that hinted at resentment. In return, he listened to her responses with his own quiet vigilance, noting when her voice softened or tightened. Their conversations resembled a dance of concealed truths, each waiting for the other to reveal a little more. At night, the scrutiny deepened, in the dim light of candles or the cold glow of moonlight. The king sought reassurance he could not ask for openly. He watched her face when he spoke of his fears. Searching for reactions he tried to disguise as curiosity. She observed him in return, measuring the way his shoulders tensed when he mentioned the council, the flicker in his eyes when a certain nobleman's name drifted into the room. Their intimacy became a space where both sought comfort, yet guarded themselves with equal vigilance. Each night carried the quiet intensity of an unspoken interrogation. He asked questions softly, sometimes about the court, sometimes about her, sometimes about himself. These inquiries appeared affectionate, but they served a deeper purpose. He wanted confirmation, reassurance, validation, proof that she remained loyal even when he doubted his own stability. She responded with care, navigating each question with the awareness that a misstep could shift his perception of her. Her words mattered, but her silences mattered more. The king listened to what she said, but he listened even more closely to what she did not. She learned that love, in this palace, demanded vigilance. No emotion existed without consequence. If she hesitated too long before answering, he sensed distance. If she answered too quickly, he sensed concealment. Every night required subtle control, a gentle touch paired with a calm tone, a steady breath masking the calculations behind her composure. She understood that his affection made him vulnerable, and that vulnerability made him unpredictable. To stay beside him, she had to watch every shift in his demeanor as though her survival depended on it. Because it did. The king, for his part, returned the scrutiny. He studied her reactions with the same intensity she used to study his. He noticed when she grew quiet at the mention of a certain noblewoman, when her expression tightened at the sound of a servant's footsteps outside the door, when her voice dipped too softly during a tense moment. His love, if it could be called that, came with the expectation that she would remain constant, soothing, loyal. He needed certainty in a world that offered none, so he observed her relentlessly, hoping to recognize any sign of betrayal before it reached him. Their relationship became a loop of mutual observation. He watching her to feel secure, she watching him to stay alive. The boundaries blurred until neither could separate affection from assessment. A lingering kiss could mask a silent judgment. A whispered confession could conceal a test. A shared moment of stillness could hold more unspoken tension than peace. And yet, beneath the scrutiny lay something undeniably human, a fragile yearning for connection in a world that weaponized every emotion. They sought comfort in each other, even as fear shaped their intimacy. They held each other at night not only out of love, but out of the need to believe that someone in the palace understood them. But understanding demanded attention, and attention demanded vigilance. And vigilance blurred the meaning of love, until both wondered whether they felt affection or only the desperate need for its illusion. In the Tudor world, to love was to watch, and to be loved was to be watched. It settles like the unsettling truth that closeness sharpens awareness rather than softening it. Another tension gathers beneath the fragile warmth they share. Beyond that, tension rises to a deeper revelation, preparing to expose how power reshapes every private bond inside the palace walls. Power inside the Tudor palace never moved loudly. It shifted in small, almost invisible motions. Soft glances, changed routines, subtle adjustments in proximity, and nowhere were these shifts more visible than in the king's private chambers, where the presence of a mistress could reorder the entire hidden hierarchy without a single proclamation. In the great halls, influence announced itself with ceremony. In the royal apartments, it whispered. A mistress learned early that closeness to the king was the true measure of power. Whoever occupied his attention, whether for an evening or a season, gained access to a level of truth no official could secure. Ministers interpreted his decrees. She interpreted his silences. Courtiers analyzed his decisions. She saw the doubts that shaped them before he spoke a word. Those who lingered nearest him, even briefly, understood the changing winds of favor long before they reached the council chamber. Her nearness became both a privilege and a warning. With each step the king took toward her, the court reshuffled its expectations. Servants adjusted the rhythm of their work. Courtiers reconsidered their alliances. Even the queen altered her expressions in ways so subtle that only those paying attention would notice the strain at the edges of her composure. The mistress needed no title. Her proximity alone carried enough weight to disturb the palace's unspoken order. Information, not appearance, determined who held real influence. A single remark from the king during a quiet hour could strengthen one faction and weaken another. If he expressed irritation toward a noble family, the mistress sensed the decline before anyone else did. If he spoke warmly of a rising courtier, she recognized the shift in the palace's balance. The court relied on formal declarations. She relied on tone, pacing, and hesitation. Where officials required evidence, she read the emotional truth beneath his posture. And the information she gathered, intentionally or not, moved outward in ways that no one could trace. She might sigh in the presence of a lady-in-waiting, and that sigh would travel through the palace as rumour. She might mention the king's restless sleep to a servant, and suddenly, courtiers would speculate about political anxiety. She might look thoughtful after a private conversation, and factions would adjust their strategies. She did not need to speak openly. The palace interpreted her silence as meaning, her gestures as messages, her presence as a signal. Power drifted through the royal apartments like smoke, shapeless, yet impossible to ignore. Whoever understood the king best, even momentarily, influenced the hidden order of the court. A mistress could alter this order simply by existing near him. She was a reminder that power did not always wear velvet or carry titles. Sometimes it wore softness, moved quietly, and listened more than it spoke. But she felt the danger of this shifting influence just as sharply. Closeness to the king also meant closeness to scrutiny. Other women watched her with suspicion. Courtiers resented her invisible access. Ministers feared what she might overhear. Servants evaluated her every expression, searching for signs of favoritism that could alter their own positions. In such a world, she had to tread carefully. A single misinterpreted glance might suggest she influenced policy. A single overheard sentence might imply she was aligned with a faction she had never even spoken to. Her survival depended on allowing power to move around her, without appearing to direct it. She learned to mask the knowledge she carried, to avoid lingering too long in conversations, to keep her insights hidden behind gentle expressions. She understood that the palace tolerated her only as long as she remained useful, but not threatening, insightful, but not authoritative. The line between those expectations was thin, shifting constantly. Yet no amount of caution could stop the court from rearranging itself in response to her presence. Power travelled outward from the king's private rooms, and her proximity shaped the direction of that current, without ever intending to. She became part of the unseen machinery that kept the palace in motion. Ministers made plans while unknowingly reacting to the moods she witnessed first. Courtiers positioned themselves based on alliances she could foresee before they formed. The Queen herself felt the tremor of this changing order, even when she forced her expression into regal stillness. And in these quiet movements, the mistress saw how influence truly operated, not through declarations, but through subtle shifts no one openly acknowledged. The palace's most significant changes began in silence, inside a dimly lit room, beside a king who believed himself private, near a woman who understood more than she revealed. Power moved without footsteps. She felt it long before anyone else did. It settles like the faint realization that influence spreads far more quietly than authority ever admits. Another ripple begins to form beneath the calm surface of the king's daily routines. Within that ripple rises the truth that the palace is never still when hidden knowledge starts to drift outward. Surveillance did not begin as an intention. It slipped quietly into the mistress's life, shaping itself around fear, necessity, and the unpredictable nature of the king's affection. At first, she watched him because she had to, because knowing his moods meant protecting herself. But over time, observation stopped feeling like a choice. It became the rhythm of her days, the instinct that moved before thought, the silent habit she carried even in the hours when no danger was present. Watching him became as natural as breathing, and far more essential. She noticed everything, even when she did not mean to. The faint shift in the king's shoulders as he dressed in the morning, the slight drag in his footsteps when a decision weighed on him, the stillness in his expression when he considered a name he did not trust. These small details embedded themselves in her awareness before she realized she was tracking them. Observation turned into reflex. Steady, constant, unavoidable. Her vigilance no longer faded when the door closed or when the candles were blown out. Even in moments meant to be private, meant to be gentle, meant to hold warmth, she remained alert. When he leaned his head against her shoulder, she listened for tension in his breath. When he spoke softly in the dark, she measured the pauses between his words. When he touched her hand, she read the pressure of his fingers. Tender moments became coded exchanges, each one layered with information she could not ignore. The king did not know she watched him so closely. He believed her attention was affection, and sometimes it was. But beneath the affection lay something sharper, an awareness that never rested. She could not allow it to rest. Too much depended on understanding the subtle changes others missed. The palace was a place where moods carried consequences, where a single displeasure could reshape a life. She could not let surprise catch her. Surprise was dangerous. Eventually, vigilance bled into every corner of her existence. She observed servants, noting which ones moved with unease. She noticed courtiers lingering near doors, their whispers too quiet, their smiles too controlled. She noted the queen's silences, the shifts in the ladies-in-waiting, the faint tremors in the air before rumors broke open. Her mind became a landscape of constant assessment, never still, never quiet. Yet the transformation frightened her. She realized she no longer remembered what it felt like to experience a moment without interpreting it. She could not hear a laugh without wondering what preceded it. She could not watch the king rest without wondering what haunted him. She could not receive a compliment without searching for its motive. The world no longer appeared as it was. It appeared as a series of signals only she seemed to recognize. Caution etched itself so deeply that she sometimes startled at her own shadows, reacting to dangers that did not exist, anticipating threats that never materialized. The palace's silence, once soothing, now felt like a warning. Even joy arrived muted, filtered through the layers of self-protection she could not remove. Her vigilance had grown roots, and those roots curled around everything she felt. Love changed, too. It lost the softness she once believed it held. Affection became intertwined with awareness, tenderness with analysis. She held the king gently, but she observed him fiercely. She began to understand that she no longer loved him in the simple, unguarded way she once imagined she could. The palace had stripped innocence from affection, replacing it with something heavier, something shaped by fear, survival, and the knowledge that love inside these walls required constant attention. She wondered, sometimes, if he noticed the change in her, if he sensed her carefulness, her restraint, her quiet calculation woven into moments that should have belonged only to emotion. But if he noticed, he said nothing. Perhaps he mistook it for devotion. Perhaps he required her vigilance more than he would ever admit. Perhaps, in some hidden way, he needed her to watch him, so he did not have to watch himself. Still, the truth settled in her. She was no longer reacting to danger. She was anticipating it in everything. She no longer observed because she feared a single misstep. She observed because the habit had consumed her. Even in the gentlest hours, she remained alert. Even in the softest moments, she kept count of the signals. Even in love, she listened for warning signs. Surveillance had become her way of existing. And love, once fragile and bright, dimmed beneath the weight of her vigilance. It settles like the sorrowful truth that watchfulness can hollow out the very tenderness it seeks to protect. Another quiet shift begins to pulse beneath the routines that bind her days. Beyond that shift rises the reminder that power continues to move, reshaping everything, even when the heart longs for stillness. The strain did not arrive suddenly. It built itself slowly, pressing against her thoughts until vigilance became the only state she recognized. At first, she believed she could manage it, believed that careful attention was simply a necessary skill for survival in a court where one misheard whisper could decide fate. But over time, the habit grew sharper than she ever intended. It tightened around her, shaping her days, thinning her sleep, hollowing the quiet parts of her mind until she no longer remembered what it felt like to live without caution. Trust faded first, not because anyone betrayed her, but because the idea of trust no longer seemed possible. She studied every gesture, every pause, every turn of voice from those around her. Servants are shifting too quickly near the doorway. Courtiers, lowering their eyes at the wrong moment. Even the king himself, whose expressions once felt warm enough to carry her through the coldest hours, began to seem layered, deliberate, unreadable beneath their surface softness. She questioned everything, even the memories she once relied on. Doubt became familiar, almost comforting, because it kept her prepared. Fear followed, subtle but constant. She found herself weighing every word before speaking, noticing the danger hidden in small slips of the tongue. She rehearsed explanations in her mind long before anyone questioned her. She listened to her own voice as if it belonged to another woman, one who could ruin herself by saying too much or too little. The palace rewarded caution but punished error, and she lived inside that contradiction until it carved a permanent space in her chest. Even harmless conversations felt risky. Even silence felt exposed. The exhaustion came last, But it came hardest. It settled behind her ribs like a weight she could not shift. She lived in alertness, the way others lived in routine. Her thoughts moved before her body did, scanning the room, measuring the air, noticing details she wished she could ignore. Her mind never rested, even when her eyes closed. Sleep grew thin, broken by imagined footsteps or echoes of conversations replayed until they lost meaning. Dawn no longer felt like a beginning, only a continuation of the strain she carried into every hour. Some days, she wondered what she had become, a watcher of people rather than a person among them, a gatherer of fragments rather than a participant in her own life. She stood beside the king, but her attention floated above them both, reading the dark between his breaths. She walked through the palace, but her mind travelled ahead, predicting dangers that might never appear. Her body survived by habit, but her thoughts lived elsewhere, caught between memory and anticipation, between fear and necessity. She noticed how quieter she had grown, not because she wished to hide, but because speaking demanded energy she no longer had. She watched others laugh, their ease almost foreign to her. She envied the simplicity of their expressions, their unguarded movements, their ability to exist without calculating consequences. She did not remember when she last moved without thinking, did not remember when she last felt fully present. The palace demanded pieces of her, and she had given so many that she no longer knew which ones were missing. There were moments, in the dim hours when the corridors fell still, when she questioned whether the vigilance had ever truly been a choice, or whether it had been woven into her life the moment she stepped inside the king's chamber for the first time, carrying hope she could not afford and fear she was too young to understand. Perhaps the palace had shaped her into this quiet, a watchful creature, long before she realized she had changed. She felt the cost most clearly when she looked into the mirror. Her reflection seemed steady, composed, but her eyes told another story, tired, alert, always waiting. She saw in them the truth she rarely allowed herself to name, that survival had consumed her more completely than any affection, any ambition, any desire. She lived, but she lived inside tension so constant that peace felt dangerous. Rest felt impossible. Each day, she continued, because continuation was the only option left. But she carried the understanding that vigilance had a price, and she had paid it quietly, steadily, without protest. The court valued those who remained unseen and unheard, yet were always aware, and she had become precisely that, a presence woven into the palace's silent machinery of observation. Yet beneath all her restraint, a question lingered, whether she could ever remember who she had been before fear taught her to listen too closely, before the court taught her to see too sharply. It settles like the quiet realization that constant vigilance has carved fear into every corner of her life. Another shift waits in the distance where usefulness begins to fade with the ebb of favor. At that edge rises the unsettling question of what becomes of a woman once her knowledge is no longer desired. She understands, slowly and without ceremony, that the value of what she knows has begun to thin at the edges. The corridors that once opened for her no longer part with the same quiet eagerness, and the men who once sought her attention now pass with only the smallest nod, as if acknowledging a memory already half forgotten. Nothing dramatic occurs, no dismissal, and no proclamation, no visible change. Instead, a soft erosion begins, the kind that happens when favor cools before anyone dares to name its absence. Her knowledge, once guarded as if it were rare metal, begins to lose weight. Secrets that once made her essential are now understood by others. Repeated in council rooms, she no longer enters. A new favorite stands nearer to the king. And although no one says it directly, every angle of the court's posture tells her that information flows elsewhere. She watches the shift the way one watches the tide pull back from the shore. Not sudden, not loud, but absolute. In this place, being useful has always been a temporary condition. The court, which had once surrounded her with glances heavy with curiosity and calculation, now looks past her with polite indifference. She is not shunned. That would imply she still has the power to cause discomfort. Instead, she is allowed to fade. It is a quieter thing, and far more final. She feels the change in small details. The maid who once lingered at her doorway with subtle questions now finishes her tasks quickly and avoids conversation. The guards who once followed her movements with attention now look through her as if she were part of the stone archway. The musician who once played for her at gatherings adjusts his seating. Choosing a place closer to the woman, the king now watches. Even the candles in her room seem to burn lower, though she knows that is only her mind turning dim with reflection. There is no anger in her. She has seen this pattern before. Other women who rose briefly held influence in gestures and whispers, and then slipped back into the quiet spaces from which they came. She remembers them clearly, though the court does not. She remembers the way they walked a little slower when they understood it was ending, the way their smiles thinned into something resigned, the way their voices softened as if preparing to become irrelevant. She sees those same signs forming in herself. But what unsettles her most is not the loss of attention. It is the loss of fear surrounding her. When she was favored, people watched her every movement because she might have known something dangerous. Now, with her influence evaporating, the court stops imagining her as a threat. It is a strange kind of disappearance, one that feels like being erased while still standing in the same room. Her memories remain sharp. She still recalls the arguments behind closed doors, the shifting alliances, the unfinished conversations the king murmured into her hands. She still knows which noble plans to betray another, which council member hides resentment, which courtier fears losing an inheritance. These details once formed the outline of her safety. Now they have become heavy, like stones sitting quietly at the bottom of her thoughts. No one asks what she remembers. That is the surest sign that her relevance has expired. Whoever controls the present does not care about the past she carries. Her knowledge, gathered slowly and carefully through evenings of whispered confession, now feels like a relic nobody needs. She tells herself she should be relieved. Power always came with danger, but the relief never arrives. Instead, there is a hollow place forming where purpose used to rest. History, she knows, will not keep her name. Even the king, who once trusted her with truths he would not voice to his advisors, will recall her only as a brief comfort, a passing season of companionship. Her story will survive only in the margins. Rumours, half-remembered tales, or perhaps not at all. Her existence, so entangled with the machinery of power, will dissolve into anonymity as easily as breath fading in cold air. She walks through the court with the quiet step of someone preparing to become invisible. No one notices. That is how she knows the transformation is complete. The woman who once listened to everything now leaves no trace. She is not dismissed. She simply becomes unnecessary. And in Tudor life, unnecessary is often only one breath away from forgotten. It rests like the simple truth that usefulness fades long before anyone admits it aloud. Another silence spreads in places where her name once carried weight. At the far edge of that silence waits the question of what remains when disappearance becomes the safest form of survival. She begins to understand that the room once warmed by affection has turned into a place edged with quiet danger. Nothing in its appearance has changed. The same heavy curtains, the same soft chair near the hearth, the same shadows resting along the carved bed frame. But something in the air has shifted. It settles in the spaces between words, in the controlled rhythm of breathing, in the careful placement of hands. This room was once a refuge. Now it feels like a chamber where truths might slip out and return as consequences. He enters with the ease of routine. Yet she notices how his eyes scan the room before they reach her. It is a small gesture, a habit born not from affection, but from caution. He lowers his voice, even when no one is nearby, as if the walls themselves might betray him. She has seen this transformation before. Men who once spoke freely now measuring every sentence, as if each word carried the weight of a decision that could not be undone. The bed, once a place where whispers softened, now becomes a stage where every breath seems recorded by silence. Conversations no longer drift, they hover. He pauses before answering her questions, even harmless ones, as though searching for the safest path between truth and omission. She speaks less, listens more, not out of loyalty or tenderness, but out of the understanding that one misplaced reaction might reveal how much she truly notices. The room feels smaller with every passing evening, not because of its walls, but because of the shrinking space for sincerity. There was a time when vulnerability passed easily between them. Unsteady laughter, tired confessions, melodies hummed without thought. Those moments have evaporated. The closer he stands, the more distance she feels. Affection, once effortless, now carries the tension of negotiation. She studies the angle of his shoulders, the shift of his jaw, the flicker in his expression when a subject strays too near something sensitive. These signs guide her more than his words ever could. She no longer knows which version of him will enter the room each night. The weary man seeking comfort, the calculating mind guarding secrets, the restless ruler expecting obedience, or the anxious lover fearing betrayal in every silence. The uncertainty threads itself through everything. She holds her breath without realizing it, waiting to learn who she must be in response. The danger does not come from raised voices or sharp gestures. It comes from the gentleness. Too slow, too measured, too careful. He handles her as if she were both a comfort and a threat. And perhaps she is. She knows too much. She has heard too much. And he senses it. Affection becomes a shield over something far more brittle. She feels the change in her own body, shoulders tense even while reclining. Hands folded, not in softness but restraint. Breaths kept quiet so they do not draw attention. There is no moment here that does not require awareness. She watches his expression with the attention of someone reading coded messages. Every smile feels slightly borrowed. Every touch carries the echo of a question. The room around them becomes a geography of caution. The hearth is where he stands when he wants to appear calm. The edge of the bed is where he sits when he is uncertain. The window is where she looks when she wants to avoid revealing her thoughts. None of these actions is spoken about. They simply happen, night after night, until the patterns become their own language. Yet it is the absence of ease that wounds deepest. She once believed that love could soften the hard angles of court life. She now sees that it only shifts them into new shapes. When affection becomes a mask for fear, intimacy becomes the most fragile place of all. She lies beside him, knowing that every shared breath holds risk. The nearness feels less like comfort and more like exposure. There are moments when he reaches for her hand, and she feels the memory of warmth return for a heartbeat. But the warmth does not stay. It flickers, then dies, like a candle touched by a draught. She wonders if he feels it too. The awareness that this closeness no longer protects either of them. The room remains dim and quiet, but it no longer belongs to affection. It belongs to vigilance. And vigilance is not a place where anyone can truly rest. It lingers like the realization that tenderness cannot survive where suspicion has taken root. Another unease gathers in the dim glow where trust once lived. Beyond that uneasy glow rises the question of what becomes of love when danger becomes its closest companion. They are remembered softly, as if they belong to the realm of romance. Figures wrapped in silk, leaning close to kings. Whispering secrets meant only for the stillness of night. That is the story most people prefer, the idea that these Tudor mistresses lived in a world shaped by passion and affection. But the truth, when observed closely, carries a colder texture. They loved in silence, moved carefully, and learned to breathe without drawing attention. They did not live like cherished companions. They lived like watchful guards, unarmed, unrecognized, but always alert. A mistress in the Tudor court understood early that affection alone could never protect her. Love was a currency too fragile, too changeable, too vulnerable to mood, rumor, and ambition. What protected her was attention, where it was directed, how it shifted, and what it revealed. She learned to listen not only to words, but to pauses. She memorized tone, posture, the tremor of hesitation that hinted at danger. She knew that survival depended not on how much she was adored, but on how accurately she could read the man who adored her. In the dim chambers, where tapestries softened the sound of breathing, she perfected the art of being still. A still woman was a listening woman, and a listening woman became indispensable. Men confided more to silence than to sympathy. He would sit beside her, remove the weight of the crown from his thoughts, and speak in low tones that trembled with truths he could not voice elsewhere. She listened. She nodded. She asked nothing. Her presence became the space where secrets rested. But secrets never rested for long. A mistress held them like glass, beautiful, dangerous, capable of cutting deeply if mishandled. She could not repeat them, but she could not forget them either. Memory became both shield and burden. She walked through corridors with the faces of courtiers passing like shadows, each one unaware that she carried more knowledge than her polite smile revealed. In that knowledge lay her power. In that knowledge also lay her doom. She loved, perhaps, gently, quietly, the way someone loves while knowing the world is watching. But love could not erase the truth that everything she was allowed to keep could be taken back without warning. One evening of displeasure, one rumor whispered too loudly, one misinterpreted expression could turn affection into dismissal. She lived in a permanent twilight between desire and danger. She was expected to offer comfort, but comfort was never simple. To soothe him, she had to understand him. To understand him, she had to observe him. To observe him, she had to anticipate shifts in power before he felt them himself. It was a role without title, without reward, and without safety, and still she played it, night after night, because stepping out of it meant fading into irrelevance. History rarely writes their names with care. They appear in footnotes, in accusations, in anecdotes shaped by men who never entered their private rooms. They are described as temptresses, distractions, symbols of royal indulgence, rarely as what they truly were, women forced into vigilance, women who navigated intimacy as if it were a battlefield, women whose hearts were never allowed to rest. The weight of their awareness seeped into every gesture. When he reached for her hand, she felt the warmth but also the responsibility. When he asked for comfort, she gave it, knowing that her response might determine how the night unfolded. Affection became labor. Tenderness became a strategy. Silence became the language that kept her alive. Some nights, after he had fallen asleep, she would sit upright on the edge of the bed and watch the slow rhythm of his breathing. In those moments, she looked less like a lover and more like a sentry. She guarded not his body, but his vulnerabilities. The secrets he spilled without realizing how deeply they bound her fate to his. She could not leave, because leaving meant losing relevance. She could not speak, because speaking meant risking everything. She could only stay in that dim half-light, holding knowledge that did not belong to her, shaping herself around the shifting moods of power. What they called love was a structure built from caution, What they called affection was a negotiation with danger, and what they called privilege was, in truth, a life with no place to fall safely. These women did not crumble under pressure. They grew quiet, sharper, more perceptive. They survived by becoming shadows, always present, never fully seen. When their time ended, because it always ended, they slipped out of the story as if they had never been there. The rooms they once warmed with companionship accepted new names. New faces, new voices whispered into the same pillows. Their knowledge, once so coveted, evaporated. Their influence dissolved the moment the king's interest shifted. The vigilance that shaped their lives left no monument except in the depths of their memory. History still writes them as lovers, but anyone who looks closer sees the truth. They lived as guards. They protected themselves, protected the men who claimed to love them, and protected the fragile political balance that trembled in every whispered confession. Their devotion was not romantic, it was disciplined. Their affection was not free, it was monitored by fear. Their endurance was not praised, it was expected. They learned that love in the Tudor court was not a gentle place to rest. It was a narrow ledge where a misstep could ruin them, where secrets could poison them, where silence became their last defense. They lived in that thin, uneasy space with grace that history rarely recognizes. And so, as the story closes, one can almost see them in the half-lit rooms of the past. Still, too attentive, watchful, not queens, not advisors, not wives, guardians, silent custodians of truths too dangerous to speak. Women whose hearts beat softly beneath the weight of power they never asked to hold. May you drift into sleep with quieter thoughts than theirs, and may your night hold none of the burdens they carried. Rest well, and good night.